Welcome to Land of Horror, where horror stories come to life like never before. In today's video, we will explore chilling true events, unsolved mysteries, and the fears lurking in the shadows. From bone-chilling murder cases to supernatural phenomena that defy all explanation. Each story will take you on a journey filled with tension and suspense. You will hear about real individuals who have faced terrifying moments, life and death situations, and discoveries that send chills down anyone's spine. Prepare yourself for moments of anxiety and thrills, because these stories aren't just fiction, but the dark truths of life. Don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on notifications to join us in uncovering even more horrifying mysteries. It was late September, and the coastal town of Dorset was beginning to feel the chill of autumn creeping in. The Robinson family's house stood at the end of a narrow road, overlooking the grey, restless sea. The wind howled constantly, rattling the windows and doors, but inside, the Robinson household was quiet, or at least, it had been. For weeks now, Samuel Robinson, the eldest son, had been plagued by something far more chilling than the brisk sea air. What began as restless nights filled with vague, unsettling dreams, soon escalated into something much darker. It started with a dream. Samuel woke up in the dead of night, his body covered in cold sweat, his heart racing. The dream had been so vivid. He was standing in a dark room, unable to move, unable to speak. A heavy silence filled the air, except for the sound of something slithering just out of sight. He could feel its presence, coiling around him, but when he tried to scream, no sound came out. In the dream, he could sense it, a serpent-like entity, its cold, scaly body tightening around him, suffocating him. He woke up gasping for breath, the sensation so real that he had to remind himself it was just a nightmare. That first night, he didn't think much of it. Bad dreams happened, and he had been under a lot of stress at work. He was managing a growing marketing firm, and with the recent pressures, sleepless nights were nothing new. But over the next few days, the nightmares returned, more vivid, more terrifying. Each night, the dream progressed. He found himself in the same dark space, but the serpent grew more real, more tangible. It began to whisper to him, though he could never make out what it was saying. The weight of it coiling around him became unbearable, and he woke up choking, his hands gripping his throat, as though he was trying to pry something off. By the third night, the nightmares followed him into the waking hours. He felt a constant pressure in his throat, a raw, burning pain that never seemed to go away. He told his family about the discomfort in his throat, brushing it off as a lingering cold, but deep down, Samuel knew it was something else. Something far more sinister. His family noticed the changes in him almost immediately. Samuel had always been a composed, responsible figure, calm under pressure, the one who kept everything together. But now, he was withdrawn, irritable, his eyes darkened with exhaustion and something more, something that unsettled everyone in the house. His mother, Anne, was the first to ask if he was all right. They were sitting at the dinner table, the wind howling outside, when she noticed him rubbing his neck again. "Samuel, are you feeling okay?" she asked softly, her eyes filled with concern. He flinched at her voice, as though it pulled him out of some deep, dark thought. "Yeah," he muttered, barely making eye contact. "Just a sore throat. I'm fine." But he wasn't fine. That night, the nightmares took an even darker turn. Samuel awoke in a panic, his throat constricted, gasping for air. He stumbled out of bed, his heart racing, and ran to the bathroom. As he stood over the sink, splashing cold water on his face, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in the mirror. His face looked pale, hollow. His eyes were bloodshot, the skin around them darkened by lack of sleep. And then, as he stared at himself, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. There, just below his jawline, his skin was shifting. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, the shadows playing tricks on his mind, but as he leaned closer to the mirror, his breath catching in his throat, he could see it, something moving beneath his skin. It was faint, a small ripple, like something slithering just beneath the surface. His stomach lurched. He backed away from the mirror, his heart hammering in his chest. "No," he whispered to himself, his voice trembling. "No, this can't be real." He ran his fingers over his throat, desperately trying to convince himself that he was imagining things. But the pain was there, sharper now, and his skin felt tender, as though bruised from the inside. Panic surged through him, and he stumbled back into his bedroom, collapsing onto his bed, his hands clutching his neck. The rest of the night passed in a blur of restless tossing and turning. He didn't sleep, too afraid of what he might see in his dreams, too afraid of what was happening to his body. By the time the first light of dawn crept through the curtains, Samuel was a wreck. His hands trembled as he got dressed, his mind racing with fear and confusion. He knew he needed help. But what could he say? That he was being haunted by dreams of a serpent? That his skin was moving, shifting under his hands? No doctor would believe him. Hell, he barely believed it himself. By the time he came downstairs, the rest of the family was already up, going about their morning routines. His younger sister, Emily, shot him a worried glance as he slumped down at the breakfast table, his head in his hands. "Samuel, you don't look so good," she said, her voice hesitant. "Are you sure you're okay?" He didn't respond right away, his mind still reeling from the events of the night before. When he finally lifted his head, his eyes were distant, unfocused. "I don't know," he admitted quietly, his voice barely audible. His mother, who had been pouring coffee, stopped mid-pour and turned to face him, her brow furrowed with concern. "What do you mean? What's wrong?" Samuel hesitated, unsure of how to explain the terror he had been living through. He didn't want to sound crazy. He didn't want them to think he was losing his mind. But as he sat there, feeling the raw ache in his throat and the strange sensation crawling beneath his skin, he realized he couldn't keep it to himself any longer. "I've been having these dreams," he began, his voice strained. "About a snake. It's wrapped around me, choking me. And when I wake up, I feel like I can't breathe. And now, I swear I can feel something moving inside me." The room fell silent. His mother set the coffee pot down slowly, her eyes widening in shock. Emily exchanged a worried glance with their father, who had just walked into the room, newspaper in hand. "A snake," his father, John, repeated, his tone skeptical. "Samuel, you've been under a lot of stress lately. Maybe it's just your mind playing tricks on you." Samuel shook his head, his frustration mounting. "No, it's not just in my head. I can feel it. There's something wrong with me." His voice cracked with desperation, and for a moment, the fear in his eyes was enough to make the rest of the family pause. John set the newspaper down and took a step closer to his son, his expression softening. "All right, let's not jump to conclusions," he said gently. "We'll get you to a doctor. Maybe there's something going on that we don't understand yet. But we're going to figure it out, okay?" Samuel nodded, though deep down, he wasn't sure if any doctor could help him. Whatever this was, It felt far beyond the reach of medical science. And as the hours ticked by, he couldn't shake the growing sense of dread that whatever was happening to him was only just beginning. Days turned into a week, and Samuel's condition only worsened. The Robinson family had become trapped in a spiraling nightmare. His once clear, confident demeanor had dissolved into confusion and paranoia. Even after several visits to doctors, no one could provide any answers. A general practitioner prescribed medication for a throat infection, yet Samuel's pain continued unabated. Every day, the feeling of something crawling under his skin grew more real to him, more terrifying. Samuel sat in the dimly lit living room, absently running his fingers over his neck. The raw sensation had grown into a constant burning, as though his body was rejecting him, turning against him. His mind buzzed with fragmented thoughts, jumping between rational explanations and dark, irrational fears. His family had noticed. How could they not? Every time they saw him clutching his neck or heard his restless pacing at night, the tension in the household mounted. The family, once close-knit, was now falling apart under the strain of Samuel's illness. His mother, Anne, had taken to sleeping on the couch, too exhausted to return to her bedroom after long nights of watching over her son. His father, John, was becoming more withdrawn, his frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. Samuel's younger sister, Emily, tried to keep the peace, but the unease in the house had seeped into her as well. It was on the second Monday, after Samuel's condition began, that something changed. That morning, Anne was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for lunch, her mind elsewhere as she replayed the past few weeks over and over. She felt utterly powerless. They had seen doctors, specialists, even a neurologist, who had recommended some form of therapy. Yet nothing explained Samuel's strange symptoms. His declining mental state had everyone questioning, was this something physical, or was Samuel losing his mind? As Anne was chopping, the sound of heavy, uneven footsteps echoed from the hallway. Samuel appeared at the threshold, his face drawn and pale, his eyes hollow. He stood there for a moment, his shoulders hunched forward, staring blankly at his mother. "Samuel?" she asked cautiously, turning towards him. He didn't respond. Instead, his eyes slowly dropped to his hands, which were trembling uncontrollably at his sides. His fingers twitched as if moving on their own, a rhythm of involuntary jerks. His breathing grew shallow, and then, out of nowhere, Samuel let out a hoarse, guttural groan and doubled over, gripping his throat with both hands. "Samuel!" Anne shouted, dropping the knife and rushing toward him. He stumbled forward, collapsing into her arms. She tried to hold him up, but his body was heavier than it had ever felt before, almost dead weight. John heard the commotion and came running from the backyard. Together, they managed to get Samuel to the sofa, his breathing ragged and his face flushed red with panic. "What's happening to him?" Anne cried, her voice shaking with fear. John knelt down, holding Samuel's shoulders. "Sam, look at me. Tell me what's wrong." Samuel's eyes were wide, darting around the room, but it was as though he couldn't focus on anything. His chest rose and fell in rapid succession, his breath coming out in shallow gasps. He clawed at his throat, his fingernails digging into the flesh until red marks began to appear. "I can't breathe." Samuel choked out, his voice barely a whisper. His eyes locked onto his father's for a brief moment, wide and terrified. John immediately dialed for an ambulance, his heart racing, while Anne knelt beside Samuel, tears welling up in her eyes. It felt like they were living through someone else's nightmare. This couldn't be happening to them, not to their son. By the time the paramedics arrived, Samuel's breathing had calmed, but his eyes remained glazed, distant. He was barely responsive, slumped on the sofa with beads of sweat rolling down his face. The paramedics checked his vitals. His pulse was weak, but steady. There was no immediate sign of any physical obstruction in his throat. After a quick consultation, they decided to take him to the hospital for further evaluation. The hours at the hospital stretched endlessly. Anne and John sat in silence in the waiting room, the sterile smell of antiseptic thick in the air. Every passing minute felt like a lifetime. They didn't know what they were waiting for, a diagnosis, a sign, anything to explain what was happening to their son. But deep down, Anne had begun to fear that there was no medical answer to Samuel's condition. A doctor finally emerged, a look of concern etched across his face. He gestured for them to follow him into a small, private consultation room. As they sat down, the doctor's tone was gentle but firm. "We've run a number of tests on Samuel," he began, carefully choosing his words. "His vitals are stable, but there's no indication of any physical ailment that would explain his symptoms. No signs of infection, no obstructions in his throat." Anne felt a sinking feeling in her chest. "But he can't breathe. He says something is choking him. He's in pain." The doctor nodded sympathetically. "We've seen patients with similar symptoms before, and in many cases, these sensations can be caused by severe anxiety or stress. Sometimes, the mind can manifest physical symptoms when it's under extreme psychological pressure." John leaned forward, his face taut with frustration. "You're saying this is all in his head?" "I'm not suggesting that Samuel is imagining his pain," the doctor clarified quickly. "But we believe that there could be an underlying psychological component. I would recommend speaking to a psychiatrist, someone who can help him manage the anxiety he's experiencing." John clenched his jaw, not wanting to believe that this was simply a mental issue. "He's not crazy. There's something wrong with him, physically." The doctor remained calm. "I understand how difficult this must be, but it's important to explore all possibilities. Sometimes, the mind and body are deeply connected in ways we don't fully understand." Anne sat quietly, processing the words. Her instincts told her that there was more to Samuel's condition than just anxiety, but what if they were wrong? What if the doctors were right and this was all a manifestation of Samuel's internal turmoil? They left the hospital with Samuel a few hours later, with a referral to a psychiatrist and a sense of helplessness they hadn't felt before. As they drove home, the weight of the uncertainty pressed down on them. That night, Samuel seemed more withdrawn than ever. He sat in the living room, staring blankly at the television screen, though his eyes didn't seem to register what he was watching. Emily sat beside him, her expression filled with worry. She tried to talk to him, tried to coax him into eating, but Samuel remained silent, only occasionally rubbing his throat, as though it burned with every breath. As the days turned into weeks, the situation grew worse. Samuel's episodes became more frequent and more violent. He started waking up in the middle of the night, screaming that he couldn't breathe, clawing at his throat until it bled. The constant sense of fear and tension gripped the family tighter with each passing day. His parents had become mere shadows of their former selves, weighed down by sleepless nights and mounting desperation. Even Emily, once the optimistic glue holding them together, started to pull away, afraid of what her brother might do next. Samuel stopped going to work, unable to face the world outside the suffocating walls of his own home. He spent most of his time locked in his room, pacing back and forth, whispering to himself, convinced that something was inside him, something he couldn't get rid of. One night, in the early hours of the morning, the house was woken by a loud crash. John bolted upright, in bed, his heart pounding, immediately knowing it was Samuel. He rushed downstairs, to find the living room in disarray, furniture overturned, picture frames shattered, and in the center of it all, Samuel, standing barefoot among the broken glass, his face twisted in a look of sheer terror. "Samuel!" John shouted, rushing towards him. "What the hell is going on?" Samuel's eyes were wild, darting around the room as though he was being chased by something invisible. He backed away from his father, pressing himself against the wall, his hands trembling violently. "Get away from me!" Samuel screamed, his voice breaking with fear. "It's inside me. I can feel it." John tried to approach him, but Samuel lashed out, knocking over a nearby lamp. The sound of shattering glass echoed through the room. Anne stood frozen in the doorway, tears streaming down her face as she watched her son unravel before her eyes. "You need help," John said, his voice strained. "We can't keep going on like this. Please, Sam, let us help you." But Samuel wasn't listening. His hands were at his throat again, clawing at the skin, as if trying to rip something out. Blood began to trickle down his neck, staining the collar of his shirt. His breathing was ragged, and his eyes were wide with panic. Anne couldn't take it anymore. She rushed forward, grabbing Samuel by the shoulders, pulling him into a tight embrace, despite his struggles. "You're not alone," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We're going to get through this. Please, Samuel. Please." Samuel stopped struggling for a moment, his body going limp in his mother's arms. He let out a deep, shuddering breath, his head resting against her shoulder. For the first time in weeks, there was a brief flicker of clarity in his eyes. "I just want it to stop," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The days that followed the violent outburst were filled with silence, but not the kind that brings peace. It was a hollow, oppressive quiet, as though the entire house was holding its breath, waiting for the next inevitable breakdown. Samuel's condition had reached a point where his family could no longer pretend that this was something normal, something temporary. They had long passed the point of hoping it would just go away, and had taken to sitting by Samuel's bedroom door at night, listening to the low murmurs of his restless pacing. He spoke to himself, sometimes in frantic whispers, sometimes in incoherent mutters. The words rarely made sense, but there was always an edge of fear, like he was trying to reason with something unseen. She would hear him stop occasionally, standing in front of his mirror, his breathing heavy, his voice cracking as he muttered things like, "It's inside me and I can't get it out." It was heartbreaking, but also terrifying. Every time Samuel left his room, he seemed like a different person, more disconnected, more lost in his internal torment. And the worst part was that no one could reach him. John and Anne hadn't told anyone outside the immediate family about Samuel's situation. They weren't sure what to say. How could they explain to friends and neighbors that their son, who had been perfectly normal just a few months ago, was now plagued by visions of something crawling inside him? Even when they had tried to speak with the doctors, no one could give them a clear answer. The referral to a psychiatrist had been made, but Samuel had refused to go. The tension in the family continued to mount, especially between John and Anne. John, practical to the point of coldness at times, was beginning to lose his patience. He didn't know how to deal with a problem that couldn't be fixed with logic or reason. Anne, on the other hand, felt like she was unraveling along with her son. The constant worry, the sleepless nights, the feeling of helplessness, it was all taking its toll. One night, as they sat in the kitchen, after yet another silent dinner, John slammed his hand on the table, causing the plates to rattle. This can't go on, Anne. He needs professional help, more than what we can give him. Anne stared into her cup of tea, her fingers trembling slightly. She had heard this argument before. John thought the answer was straightforward: get Samuel to a hospital, get him into treatment. But it wasn't that simple. I know, she whispered, her voice hollow. But what if he refuses again? We can't force him. John's jaw tightened, and he stood up, pacing the small kitchen. He's not in his right mind, and he can't make these decisions for himself anymore. We're his parents. We need to step in. And do what, exactly? Lock him up in some hospital, where they'll drug him until he's a zombie. You think that will help? Anne's voice cracked with emotion. She didn't know what the right answer was, but the idea of forcing Samuel into some psychiatric ward felt like giving up on him. It felt like admitting defeat. John stopped pacing and leaned against the counter, his hands gripping the edge so tightly his knuckles turned white. I don't know, he admitted, his voice quieter now. I just don't know anymore. Meanwhile, Samuel's mental state continued to deteriorate. The hallucinations, if that's what they were, had grown more vivid. He now saw things moving in the corners of his vision during the day, shadows slithering across the walls, dark shapes that disappeared as soon as he turned his head. At night, the sensation of something under his skin was unbearable. He scratched at his neck until it bled, desperate to relieve the itching, the crawling, but it never went away. One afternoon, while Anne was out running errands and John was at work, Emily heard a crash from Samuel's room. She raced upstairs and found him standing in front of his mirror, his hands bleeding from where he had punched the glass. Shards were scattered across the floor, and Samuel stood frozen, staring at the broken reflection. Sam. Emily rushed to his side, grabbing a towel to wrap around his bleeding hands. What are you doing? You're going to hurt yourself. Samuel didn't respond. His eyes were wide, unblinking, fixated on his reflection in the shattered mirror. I don't see him, Samuel muttered, his voice distant. But he's there. I know he's there. Emily's heart pounded in her chest. She gently tried to guide him away from the broken glass, but Samuel resisted, his body rigid with tension. Who, Sam? She asked, her voice trembling. The one inside me, he whispered, his eyes never leaving the mirror. The one making me do this. Emily swallowed hard, trying to keep her voice steady. There's no one else here, Sam. It's just us. Samuel shook his head, his movements jerky, unnatural. You don't understand. He's hiding, waiting. I can feel him moving. I just need to find him. I need to get him out. A shiver ran down Emily's spine. She had never seen her brother like this before. He was no longer just paranoid or anxious, he was slipping away, consumed by whatever delusion had taken hold of him. She wanted to help him, but she didn't know how. And the fear of what he might do next was beginning to overwhelm her. That night, Emily sat with her parents in the living room, her hands wringing in her lap. Samuel was locked in his room, and she had finally convinced him to let her bandage his hands, though he hadn't said much since the incident with the mirror. We can't keep doing this, Emily said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. And looked at her daughter, her eyes filled with sorrow. What are we supposed to do? He won't listen to reason. John had been staring at the wall, his face hard and emotionless. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and steady. We have to commit him. I know it's not what anyone wants to hear, but we don't have a choice anymore. Anne flinched at the word commit. It sounded so final, so absolute. But she knew, deep down, that John was right. They couldn't handle this on their own anymore. Samuel was becoming a danger to himself and possibly to others. Emily nodded slowly. We have to try, she said. Before it's too late. The decision was made, but it weighed heavily on all of them. They would call the psychiatrist in the morning and start the process of getting Samuel the help he needed. But none of them slept well that night, haunted by the fear of what they might lose in the process. The following morning, Anne knocked on Samuel's door, her heart pounding in her chest. She had rehearsed what she was going to say over and over in her head, but now that the moment had come, she felt paralyzed with fear. Samuel, she called softly. Can I come in? There was no answer, but after a long pause, she heard the sound of the door unlocking. Slowly, she pushed it open and stepped inside. Samuel was sitting on the edge of his bed, his hands resting limply in his lap. He looked exhausted, his face pale and gaunt. His eyes, once sharp and intelligent, were now dull, filled with an emptiness that broke Anne's heart. She sat down beside him, trying to keep her voice steady. We need to talk, Sam. He didn't respond, just stared down at his hands. We've decided that you need help, she continued, choosing her words carefully. Real help. From professionals who can figure out what's going on with you. At this, Samuel looked up, his expression shifting from apathy to something more intense, fear, maybe even anger. I'm not crazy, he whispered, his voice shaking. I know you're not, Anne said quickly, reaching out to take his hand. But something's wrong, and we need to figure it out. You can't keep living like this. Samuel yanked his hand away, standing up so suddenly that Anne flinched. He paced back and forth across the room, his movements erratic, his breathing uneven. They'll lock me up, he muttered. They'll think I'm insane. But I'm not. I'm not. Anne stood, trying to remain calm, but her own fear was rising. No one's going to lock you up, Samuel. We just want to help you. But Samuel wasn't listening anymore. He was pacing faster now, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. His eyes darted around the room, as though he was looking for something only he could see. They don't understand, he whispered, more to himself than to Anne. No one understands. Anne felt a cold shiver run down her spine. She took a step toward him, reaching out again. Samuel, please. Before she could finish, Samuel suddenly stopped, turning to face her with wild, desperate eyes. I have to get it out, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I have to. And then, before Anne could react, Samuel lunged toward the nightstand, grabbing the small mirror that sat there. In one swift motion, he smashed it against the edge of the table, shattering the glass into jagged pieces. Anne screamed, rushing forward, but Samuel had already grabbed a shard of the broken mirror and was raising it to his throat. I have to get it out, he screamed, his voice breaking with hysteria. Samuel, no! Anne cried, grabbing his arm and trying to wrestle the shard from his hand. But Samuel was stronger than she realized, fueled by some kind of desperate, manic energy. In the chaos, John and Emily burst into the room, drawn by Anne's screams. John rushed forward, grabbing Samuel from behind, pulling him away from the broken glass. Stop it, Sam! Stop! John shouted, wrestling him to the ground. Samuel thrashed in his father's grip, screaming and sobbing, his eyes wide with terror. "It's inside me! It's inside me!" John held him down, his own face twisted with anguish. "There's nothing inside you, Sam. It's all in your head." But Samuel didn't believe him. He didn't believe any of them. And in that moment, as his family held him down, his mind shattered completely. Hours later, Samuel was sedated and taken to the psychiatric ward. The house was quiet, but it wasn't the same suffocating silence that had hung over them before. This silence was different. It was the silence of grief, of loss. The family sat together in the living room, but none of them spoke. There was nothing left to say. And stared at the floor, her hands trembling in her lap. She had always been the strong one, the one who kept the family together. But now, she felt broken, as though a part of her had been torn away. John sat beside her, his face buried in his hands. He had done what needed to be done, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a defeat, like they had failed their son. And Emily. Emily sat apart from them, her eyes hollow and distant. She couldn't even cry anymore. The tears had dried up, leaving only numbness behind. They had done what they had to do. But at what cost? The days following Samuel's admission to the psychiatric ward blurred into a surreal routine. The quiet of the house was oppressive. Even though Samuel had been removed from their home, his presence still lingered like a shadow. His room remained untouched, the door always shut, as if sealing it would somehow prevent the memories from spilling out. And visited the hospital daily. At first, she hoped that seeing her face would help Samuel recover some semblance of normality. But each time she sat by his side, she was met with blank stares or incoherent mutterings. Samuel wasn't the boy she knew anymore. His gaze was distant, his voice often quiet and vacant. Sometimes, he didn't recognize her at all. John, on the other hand, buried himself in work. It was the only way he could cope. Being at home made him feel powerless, so he spent long hours at the office, avoiding the pain of facing what had happened. It was his way of grieving without acknowledging it. Emily, though quieter than before, tried to keep the family together. She managed the day-to-day tasks, making sure her mother ate, that the house didn't completely fall apart. But deep inside, she was haunted by the memory of that day, Samuel's screams, the sight of him holding the shard of glass to his throat. The image played over and over in her mind, like a nightmare she couldn't wake from. Samuel's doctors were at a loss. Despite multiple evaluations, the cause of his psychosis remained elusive. They ran tests, MRI scans, neurological exams, blood work, but found nothing physically wrong. His brain functions appeared normal, and yet, his mental state was deteriorating by the day. They diagnosed him with severe schizophrenia, but it didn't sit right with Anne. She had done her research, read every pamphlet, and spoken to psychiatrists. Samuel's symptoms, the sudden onset, the intensity of his delusions, it didn't seem to fit neatly into any diagnosis. But the doctors were adamant, Samuel's mind had fractured, and it would take time, possibly years, to piece it back together. Anne couldn't accept it. Something more was going on. She knew her son, and this wasn't just a mental illness. There had to be another explanation. She became obsessed with finding out what went wrong, spending sleepless nights reading medical journals, consulting specialists, and seeking second opinions. But the more she searched, the fewer answers she found. Emily avoided the hospital for the first few weeks. Seeing Samuel in the psychiatric ward, sedated and distant, was too much for her to bear. She had always looked up to her older brother, admired his intelligence and confidence. But now, he was a shell of that person, lost in his own mind. The thought terrified her. One evening, Emily sat alone in her room, flipping through an old photo album. She stopped at a picture of her and Samuel as children, sitting on the porch, grinning at the camera. Samuel had his arm around her, and she remembered how safe she had always felt with him. He had been her protector. But now, she didn't even know who he was anymore. Her phone buzzed, jolting her from her thoughts. It was a message from her friend, Megan, asking if she wanted to go out for a drink. Emily hesitated. She hadn't been out in weeks, isolating herself as she tried to process everything that had happened. But the idea of escaping, even for a little while, was tempting. She quickly typed back, "Sure. Meet you at 8. The bar was dimly lit and crowded, the air thick with the smell of alcohol and perfume. Megan greeted Emily with a hug, pulling her toward the bar where a group of their friends were already seated. For a brief moment, Emily felt like her old self, laughing at their jokes, sipping her drink, pretending that everything was normal. But the laughter felt hollow. Her mind kept drifting back to Samuel, wondering if he was okay, if he was awake and alone in his sterile hospital room. The thought gnawed at her, and by the time she finished her second drink, she felt the weight of it pressing down on her chest. Megan noticed her distraction. "Hey, you okay?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. Emily forced a smile. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just tired, I guess." "You've been through a lot," Megan said softly, squeezing Emily's hand. "It's okay to not be okay." Emily nodded, but the truth was, she didn't know how to be okay anymore. Her whole world had changed, and she didn't know how to fit into it. As the night dragged on, Emily's anxiety grew. The loud music, the chatter of people around her, it all felt overwhelming. She excused herself to the bathroom, hoping that some time alone would calm her down. In the dimly lit bathroom, Emily stared at herself in the mirror, trying to steady her breathing. But the reflection staring back at her seemed foreign. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, the toll of the last few months etched into her features. Suddenly, she felt it, a creeping sense of dread, as though she was being watched. Her skin prickled with unease, and she quickly glanced around the empty bathroom. No one was there, but the feeling didn't go away. It was irrational, she knew that. But for a brief moment, she felt what Samuel must have been feeling all along, the paranoia, the fear that something unseen was lurking just out of sight. Shaking her head, Emily splashed cold water on her face, trying to shake off the sensation. But as she dried her hands and left the bathroom, the unease lingered. Something had changed, though she couldn't quite put her finger on it. A few days later, Emily finally gathered the courage to visit Samuel at the hospital. She hadn't told her parents, not wanting to worry them. But after that night at the bar, after feeling that creeping dread herself, she needed to see him. She needed to understand what he was going through, to connect with him in some way. The psychiatric ward was quiet, the sterile smell of disinfectant hanging in the air. Emily's heart pounded as she approached Samuel's room, unsure of what to expect. When she walked in, Samuel was sitting by the window, staring out at the hospital garden. He didn't turn around when she entered. "Hey," Emily said softly, her voice shaky. Samuel didn't respond at first. For a moment, Emily thought he hadn't heard her. But then, slowly, he turned his head, his eyes locking onto hers. There was something different in his gaze, something sharper, more focused than the last time she had seen him. "Emily," he said, his voice low and hoarse. Emily's heart ached at the sound of his voice. She hadn't heard him say her name in so long. "Yeah, it's me," she said, walking over and sitting in the chair next to him. "How are you feeling?" Samuel didn't answer right away. He just stared at her, his eyes searching her face as though trying to find something. "They think I'm crazy," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm not. You know that, right?" Emily swallowed hard, unsure of how to respond. "I know you're going through something," she said carefully. "And we're all trying to help." "They don't understand," Samuel continued, his voice growing more urgent. "No one does. But you feel it, don't you?" Emily's breath caught in her throat. "Feel what?" Samuel leaned forward, his eyes wide, his voice a frantic whisper. "The thing inside me. It's real, Emily. I know you can feel it too." Emily's pulse quickened, the memory of that night in the bar flashing through her mind, the irrational fear, the sense of being watched. But she couldn't let herself fall into the same delusion. She couldn't let Samuel's paranoia consume her too. "There's nothing inside you, Sam," she said gently, trying to keep her voice steady. "It's all in your head." Samuel shook his head violently, his hands clenching into fists. "No. You don't understand. It's real, Emily. It's real." Tears welled up in Emily's eyes as she watched her brother unravel before her. She wanted to believe him, wanted to comfort him, but she knew she couldn't. She had to hold on to reality, for both of their sakes. "I'm sorry, Sam," she whispered, her voice breaking. I can't do this." She stood up, her legs trembling beneath her, and walked out of the room, without looking back. Samuel's frantic whispers followed her down the hallway, echoing in her mind long after she left the hospital. As the weeks went by, the strain on the family only worsened, and became increasingly distant, throwing herself into researching every possible explanation for Samuel's condition. John, still avoiding the emotional weight of the situation, spent more time at work, leaving early in the morning and returning late at night. The family was fracturing, and no one seemed capable of holding it together. Emily, despite her best efforts, felt herself slipping. The encounter with Samuel had shaken her deeply, and though she tried to push the memories away, they kept creeping back in, his desperate eyes, the certainty in his voice when he spoke of the thing inside him. She started having nightmares, dark, twisted dreams, where Samuel's voice echoed through empty hallways, calling her name, begging for her help. She would wake up in a cold sweat, her heart racing, the sense of dread lingering long after the dream had ended. It wasn't long before the nightmares bled into her waking life. She started feeling that same creeping unease during the day, the irrational fear that something was watching her, following her. She knew it wasn't real, knew it was just her mind playing tricks on her. But the more she tried to push it away, the stronger it became. Emily sat in her room, the soft hum of the ceiling fan the only sound punctuating the suffocating silence. The house felt more like a tomb now, empty and cold, even though Anne was still downstairs and John was somewhere between the office and home, drifting. Emily couldn't shake the weight that had settled over her like a second skin, heavy and oppressive, making every breath feel like a chore. The nightmares had become a constant, creeping into every corner of her life. The sense of dread was growing stronger, the feeling that something dark and wrong was watching her from the shadows. The rational part of her knew it was all in her head, an extension of her fear for Samuel. But another part, the part that had felt that chill in the bathroom, wasn't so sure anymore. She hadn't spoken to anyone about it, and was too lost in her obsessive research, and John had become a ghost. There was no one left to talk to. She had tried to tell Megan once, but halfway through the conversation, she had stopped herself. She couldn't sound crazy. She had to hold it together. Yet, deep down, she felt like she was unraveling. The tipping point came one cold evening when Emily was alone in the house. It was a Tuesday, and she had come home from university early, unable to focus during her lectures. The house felt eerie, quieter than usual, and was out running errands, and John was working late again. Emily was sitting in the kitchen, trying to distract herself with an assignment, when the sound of footsteps echoed through the empty hall. She froze, her heart thudding in her chest. The logical part of her brain told her it was just her imagination, or maybe the old house settling. But the footsteps were slow and deliberate, and they seemed to be coming closer. She stood up slowly, her hands trembling as she walked toward the hallway. Her breath hitched as she peered around the corner. There was no one there, but the air felt thick, oppressive, as though someone, or something, was watching her. "Hello," she called out, her voice shaky. The silence that followed was deafening, but the feeling of being watched didn't fade. In fact, it grew stronger. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and Emily's heart nearly stopped. The rational part of her brain screamed that it was just a power surge, nothing more. But her instincts told her otherwise. She could feel the cold sweat trickling down her spine, her pulse pounding in her ears. The flickering stopped, and the house was plunged back into silence. Emily forced herself to move, her legs feeling like lead as she walked back to the kitchen. She grabbed her phone from the counter, her fingers shaking as she dialed her mother's number. The phone rang once, twice, then went to voicemail. "Mom, it's Emily. Are you coming home soon?" she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Call me back when you get this." She hung up and set the phone down, her hands still trembling. The house felt darker, even though the lights were on. Every shadow seemed to stretch a little too long, every creak of the floorboards a little too loud. As she turned to leave the kitchen, she caught a glimpse of something in the corner of her eye, just a flicker, barely there, but enough to make her stop in her tracks. She turned slowly, her breath catching in her throat. At first, she didn't see anything. But then, in the reflection of the kitchen window, she saw it, a shadow, standing just behind her, tall and unnaturally still. Emily's blood ran cold. She spun around, her eyes wide, but there was nothing there. The kitchen was empty, just as it had been a moment before. But the reflection, it had been real. She was sure of it. She stumbled back, her heart racing, and bolted from the kitchen, her footsteps echoing through the empty house. She ran up the stairs, her mind screaming at her to leave the house, to get out. But she couldn't bring herself to run outside. Instead, she slammed the door to her room shut, locking it behind her. Inside her room, Emily's breath came in short gasps as she leaned against the door. Her phone buzzed on her bed, and she jumped, her nerves frayed. It was a text from her mother. "Running late. Be home in an hour. Don't wait up. Love you." Emily stared at the message, her fingers hovering over the screen. She wanted to tell her mother about the shadow, about the footsteps. But she couldn't. And wouldn't believe her. No one would. They would think she was losing her mind, just like Samuel. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a call. She answered it, relief washing over her when she saw Megan's name on the screen. "Hey," Emily said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Hey, are you okay?" Megan asked, her voice laced with concern. "You've been acting really off lately." Emily hesitated, her hand gripping the phone tightly. I don't know," she admitted. "There's just something's wrong. I can feel it." "What do you mean?" Megan asked, her tone softening. Emily glanced around her room, her eyes darting to the shadows in the corners. "I don't know. It's just this feeling, like something's watching me. And I saw something tonight." "Saw what?" Megan's voice was barely a whisper now, as if she could sense the tension in Emily's words. "I don't know," Emily said again, her voice trembling. "It was just a shadow. But it felt so real." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment, Emily thought Megan might dismiss her concerns. But then she spoke. "Maybe you should get out of the house," Megan suggested. "Come over to mine for the night. We can talk, and you won't be alone." Emily's first instinct was to agree. The thought of leaving the house, of being somewhere else, was appealing. But something stopped her. A part of her felt like she couldn't leave. Like whatever was in the house wouldn't let her go. I don't know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think I need to stay." Megan didn't push her, but the concern in her voice was evident. "Okay. But call me if you need anything. Promise?" "I promise," Emily said, though she wasn't sure if she meant it. That night, Emily lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling. Sleep wouldn't come. Her mind was racing, her thoughts a tangled mess of fear and doubt. The house was too quiet, and every creak of the floorboards sent her heart racing. She closed her eyes, trying to calm herself, but the image of the shadow in the window wouldn't leave her mind. It had been there. She knew it had. She wasn't imagining things. But how could she prove it? Just as she was about to drift off into a restless sleep, she heard it again, the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from the hallway outside her room. Emily's eyes shot open, her heart pounding in her chest. She lay completely still, listening. The footsteps stopped outside her door. For a long moment, there was silence. Then, a soft knock. Emily froze, her blood turning to ice. "Emily," a voice whispered from the other side of the door. It was Samuel's voice. She knew it couldn't be him. He was in the hospital, miles away. But the voice was unmistakable. "Emily," the voice said again, a little louder this time. Her breath hitched, and she pressed herself deeper into the bed, her hands clutching the blanket tightly. She didn't dare move, didn't dare make a sound. The door handle rattled, and Emily's heart nearly stopped. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. The footsteps retreated down the hallway, and the house was plunged back into silence. But Emily didn't relax. She lay there, wide awake, until the first light of dawn filtered through her window. The days that followed blurred into a haze of fear and paranoia. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, deeply, fundamentally wrong. The shadow she had seen, the voice at her door, it was all too real. She started avoiding the house as much as possible, spending long hours at the library or at Megan's, anywhere but home. When she was at the house, she barely slept. The footsteps came almost every night now, always stopping outside her door, always accompanied by Samuel's voice. She had started locking her door every night, but it didn't make her feel any safer. and had noticed the change in her, but she was too consumed by her own obsession to intervene. John, as usual, was absent. They were all drifting apart, caught in their own spirals of grief and confusion. Emily knew she couldn't go on like this. The fear was eating away at her, driving her to the brink of madness. She needed answers. And deep down, she knew there was only one place she could find them.